Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries weekly seminar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this series comes from the Point Grey campus of the University of British Columbia, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. You may be joining us from traditional lands across British Columbia, Canada, and the world, and we'd like to acknowledge the owners and caretakers of those lands as well. As far as the process of the seminar, if you are online and you have a question for our speaker, simply type it in the chat at any time during the talk or after the talk, and those questions will be read out, or you can also raise your hand in the reaction box, both of which are usually at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Finally, I want to remind everyone that it's everyone's responsibility to help craft a positive public speaking and knowledge exchange experience, especially for graduate students and young scientists. We ask that we work together to make this a good experience for all and raise only mindful and respectful questions or comments in this forum. With that in mind, it's my honor to introduce my longtime colleague, Dr. Andrew Trites, who's a prominent figure in marine biology and a passionate educator here at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Trites has dedicated over 3 decades, possibly more, but I don't want to embarrass him, to the study of marine mammals, focusing on their behavior, ecology, and conservation. As the director of the Marine Mammal Research Unit here at the IOF, Dr. Trites leads groundbreaking research that examines the complex interactions between marine species and their environments. His work not only enhances our scientific understanding, but also plays a crucial role in shaping effective conservation strategies. To further that goal, Andrew is an active voice in bridging the gap between science, advocacy, and government policies. In that same vein, today, Dr. Trites will be discussing his participation in a unique situation involving marine biology and Indigenous rights. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Trites as he shares his insights and knowledge with us. Andrew.
Thank you, Dave. So I'm going to stay tethered here because we don't want the mics clanging, and we're hoping it's going to be a seamless slideshow and talk today. As most of you know, as a professor here, our jobs are typically tied up with teaching, supervising students, writing research grants, doing research. But every now and then we end up in US federal courts or writing court depositions for Canadian government. And particularly with marine mammals, there's a lot of things that come up. And what I want to share with you today is a story that started pre-COVID. And it started with a phone call. It was the end of August. I was upstairs here when, like everybody else that was here, the phone rang, picked it up, and it was a young woman from Seattle. And she introduced herself as being a lawyer. And I thought, oh, and she says, I'm looking for some help. I wonder if you would help me. I'm representing 2 tribes, the Quileute and the Quinault from Washington State. And we need an expert. We need, and I go, yes, and what? So what we need to know, what marine mammals were present in the waters of Washington State in 1856. That was the year that the treaty was signed, and they wanted to know for basically going to court because these 2 tribes are trying to establish their treaty rights. They've been to court multiple times, had always lost, and they felt they're going to try again. And so I said to her, I have no idea what was there in the 1850s. It's not a part of the ocean that I spent time in. I've never been offshore of Washington to look. I said, but I know somebody who is an expert. And I gave her his name and contact. That's where he does almost all his research. She called me back within an hour and said, he won't help me. He can't help me. We really have no one else to go to. Won't you help? And I said to her, I can't promise anything because there's almost no records that I'm aware of, but I was willing to do my best and see what I could do. And the idea was to establish what was being hunted at that time in order to show that their rights went offshore because they're being denied the ability to fish in areas that they've been guaranteed in 1856 to have access to. It turned out that in the court case, they were not only fighting against the US government, they're also fighting against their neighbors, the Makah to the north, who also wanted them not to have their treaty rights established. So I contacted Frances Robertson. She was one of my former PhD students. She loves whales. She's also a historian. Her parents are historians. And so I figured maybe between the two of us, we could piece things together. One of the first things we did is we started to look into, we went to the UBC archives here on campus, went to University of Washington, and we got together some really old photos. And the first photo that caught my attention was this one here, which I hope is going to come up. Having said that, everything works. Oh dear. Here we go. This picture here, it's taken in La Push, which is on the Washington coast. And here on the beach, and you can see that, yes, you can recognize people, but do you recognize what species of animals there on the beach? This picture was taken in the late 1800s. And these are northern fur seals. And what struck me is that these are not beach cast animals. These are hunted animals. I studied northern fur seals for my PhD thesis. And like all of you, whatever you study for your master or PhD thesis, those species never leave you. You follow them no matter how trivial their new research findings might be. And I knew they should not be here on the beach. How did they get there? I know all about their life histories. It didn't make any sense. Where did these animals come from? So the Treaty of Olympia, signed in 1856, and it established the right of taking fish at all usual and custom grounds and stations. It's further secured to said Indian in common with the citizens of the territory. Now, as you read this, you're probably thinking of fish, those cold-blooded animals, but in 1856, generals and politicians, they didn't know about Linnaean or the whole classification system. For them, fish included marine mammals. In fact, there was a very famous court case in the early 1800s to establish that whale oil was not fish oil and should not be taxed as such. So it's been through the courts, but at the time of signing, this treaty established was under the understanding that fish included everything in the aquatic realm. And in this case, it meant marine mammals as well. So here's the map that went with it that was sketched out, showing here the territories of the Quileute, the Hoh, the Queets, and the Quinault. And just north of there, you can see in the white is where the Makah tribal lands are, and then Strait of Juan de Fuca and Vancouver Island across from that. So again, just placing this into a bit more context, geographically, we're looking at over here in this piece of coastline. So to answer this question then of what species were there, in this case, they wanted really to know, when she called me first, she was asking for 30 miles. So basically we're looking at anything over 20 miles. So I start here with a map, and we can see the bathymetries, and I've drawn on there the 20 and 40 mile lines, which is of course what the US uses, but that would be the equivalent to 32 kilometers or 64 kilometers offshore. So what marine mammals were out there in, and I have to go a year before. So in 1850, what was there? And I guess I'd like to throw that challenge out to you. If you had picked up this phone, you agreed to work on this court case, what's your source of information? Well, we can certainly turn to a few sources. One is just basic ecology. We now have today the use of satellite tracking tags. There have been surveys offshore, and so there are records to figure things out. But of course, we're making an assumption that the conditions today are what they were back in the 1850s. A second source here is ethnography, which is the description of customs of individual peoples and cultures. And there are some written records, including some diaries that were kept and published to give some insights. And finally, we've got archaeology on here. And in this court case, they ended up having experts for all these areas and got a chance to pool our data together. So why archaeology? Well, it's basically, and I don't think this audience needs a whole lot of explanation on it, but the middens should contain species that they were consuming going back hundreds, if not to over 1,000 years ago. So these are the 12 species that we know from modern day biology exist over 20 miles offshore. And so you can see we got everything from the upper left corner, the dolphins, porpoise, large whales, and even a pinniped on here. There's also some elephant seals and a few other species too. But the most remarkable thing is that when we go through all of the middens and everything's been compiled, Which species here do you think was the most prominent that they would find? It turns out to be one of these species accounted for over 80% of all the mammal fauna, and I'm including rabbits and deer in here. That one species is down here. It was my PhD animal. It was the northern fur seal. That over 80% of all the mammal fauna was from the species, and yet it didn't make sense because where did they come from? In the middens, it wasn't just, we know that adult females from Alaska, they migrate through the waters. They don't come ashore ever. But the other strange thing is that it wasn't just females, there were bulls. So the big males were present. The size of newborn pups was present, juveniles, all the age classes. Literally, it was like there'd been a breeding site there and they're being removed. And yet there's no record of that ever having existed. Well, to add another layer to this, it turned out that archaeologists, prior to me getting involved, said, no, these aren't northern fur seal remains. These are Cape Flattery fur seal remains. It's a mythical creature. And I'm going to take you through here in a minute, but the point with this species is here are the 34 known species of marine mammals. We've got here the northern fur seal. We've got down here, I think we've got the Guadalupe fur seal on here, but there's no Cape Flattery fur seal. So why did something this become a prominent species? In this case, the archaeologists were trying to explain the presence of these bones when they were also informed by modern day biology that this species never bred here. So they hypothesized, although went beyond that because once it got to court, this was a real species. So now I was trying to explain how this species never existed. So where's Cape Flattery? Again, I'm going to take you back here, zoom you in to Washington State. There's Vancouver, Seattle, and there at that tip is Cape Flattery. So it was named in essence because it was nearby and a point of land. Here we have then the territories of the Makah, the Quileute, and the Quinault. And the question is, where did these fur seals come from? If they were from Alaska, then they had to have been taken way out here is where they had to go to catch them. They never came ashore. So what do we know in terms of modern day biology? Well, as you look at a map, and this would have been starting in the late 1800s, that it was clear that there were just a few major breeding sites. So the core of the population, most of them bred here on the Pribilof Islands, but after the breeding season, so it's summer into fall, they migrate throughout the entire North Pacific, with adult females coming down into the waters offshore of Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia too. Then on the Russian side, there's the Commander Islands, and then we've got Robben Island and the Kurill Islands. So there's only these 4 known breeding sites. At least when I was doing my PhD, that's all we knew about. We've got then a little bit here of background to fill you in. So here we have your typical happy fur seal family. There's Dad, the bull. He's about 130 kilos, but will go up to 200 when it's breeding season. And I think one of the remarkable things here is if you look at differences in sizes, that males are 6 times bigger than females. And it's fun when you talk to kids and say, can you imagine if your dad was 6 times bigger than your mom? And just that, I think it's the greatest amount of sexual dimorphism of any species. So I've got a little video clip here. I want to give you a sense of what it's like to be with fur seals on a rookery. And there should be some sound coming here in just a second. Very silent. So a few things on here. There's some bulls here and some females that come ashore. Most of the mothers are off feeding for about a week-long trip in the Bering Sea and coming back. So there's a lot of extra pups about, and females will nurse them for a couple of days and go back out to sea. And just as a side note, the reason why Alaska was purchased from Russia was owning rights to these fur seals. It was garment makers from the Civil War that wanted a new business after uniforms were out of fashion. They went for women's fashions, and they lobbied Congress to buy Alaska's with the rights to kill the fur seals. That's a pup that's found his mom. And normally the volume would be much, much louder, And then you can really hear the sounds here. Okay, so research there, and so here at the time there would have been probably 3 million animals prior to the Europeans coming in to remove them. The population is currently declining, but it has been certainly usually over about 1 million animals. So extremely high densities. One way we study them is there's been these catwalks, very slippery, mind you. Should you fall in, you will die. And I've never fallen in, but in Russia, there have been a few people that have fallen in and they never made it out. So the males are very, very territorial and they don't tolerate, but you can crawl over top and everything from pulling animals up to take measurements, putting them back down, but the bulls are another matter. The islands are remote, foggy, wet, and dangerous. Humans have never lived on this island or the other islands, the other three where they breed. It's probably what allowed them to survive as a species is that they weren't discovered because they are, once you've found them, the easiest of all the animals to hunt on land. They are considered a pelagic species. They never come ashore except to breed. And it brings back to this question was there another species? So in the Northern Hemisphere, it's only been the northern fur seal, but also the Galapagos fur seal from Mexico, which is also hunted to near extinction and is now in the process of recovering. So I mentioned this paper to you before. It's written by authors who are from the University of Victoria. It was Susan Crockford as the lead author. There's the title here, the Cape Flattery fur seal, an extinct species of Calorinus in the Eastern North Pacific. So they put it out as a question, although in subsequent discussions, it became more like a fact. This was here. So what did they base this on? Well, one was that the middens, and we've got both in British Columbia and in Washington State, but the Washington State ones have been studied much more thoroughly, contain the skeletal remains of unweaned pups, juveniles, and bulls. And they also found some historical documents that claimed that they were seeing some differences in the animals encountered off the Washington coast that made them seem like they were different than what the Pribilof fur seals were. Other things in here is they say once they put all the pieces together, in their opinion, it was conclusive that there was a local breeding non-migratory population of fur seals was once well established on the central northwest coast. And it must have been a non-migratory population that made it and gave birth on beds of kelp. And therefore they suspect it was a distinct species. So I remember when this paper came out and it was in a Canadian Archaeology Journal. And I thought, well, this is nonsense. But I didn't think to write a letter in or explain, but when you're talking to a federal judge, and as far as they know, it's peer reviewed and isn't anything that's published fact. And I had explained that, well, no, peer review typically just means that you had two people that were of the same opinion as you were and went forward, but I suspected that no biologist had ever read this. So what's part of the trouble? Well, we talk about beds of kelp. I'm not sure how many of you have ever tried to walk on a bed of kelp, but at high tide, there's not much to stand on or sit on. And also the areas where this kelp would have been were so deep, there's no way like gets down to even have kelp grow. So this would have had to been in very shallow areas next to land, and it just doesn't add up. But there was an account of a captain who had seen a seal sitting on some kelp in the 1800s, and that became the basis of this myth. In terms of a distinct species, well, fortunately, there is DNA to look at. And there was a paper that had come out as again, and so in this case, Francis and I, we're trying to pull everything we can find out to try to make sense and any research that pertains to the middens. And so this was a paper looking at the genetics here. And they compared some of the ancient bones to the modern bones from the Pribilofs. And they concluded, in fact, genetically, there's only one species of fur seal, but they have really high dispersal rates. And in fact, it's like a panmictic population where the animals are moving between the different areas. So they also put forward that the Bering Sea was a refuge, which likely is one reason why the species still exists today. So all that makes sense. Another interesting thing is back to the map, these were the four known sites. But in 1968, there were some fur seals that showed up at San Miguel Island in California. And what's really strange about these fur seals is the ones that were there, many of them had these Cyrillic tags, they had Russian letters on tags that were put onto their flippers. These animals had come from Russia and they were colonizing here. And so that got the US military involved and just trying to figure out what were these Russian animals doing in California. There was another population here that was discovered in 1980 at Bogoslav Island. And this is a remarkable island. It's a volcanic island. It's just the tip of an active volcano. And it's also an island that from the Aleuts, they know it's an island that moves because periodically it would erupt, sink, and then a new crater would form, lava dome. And it recently blew up again. And so the island, we had students out there for a few years, and the entire thing is different now as the whole island blew up. Anyway, that's a side story. And then 1996, another population was established here at the Farallon Islands. So roughly then in 2022, there are about 1.35 million fur seals, and they are all carbon copies of each other. So that still brings us this question of where did these animals that are in the middens come from? And so for that, we can turn to stable isotopes. And as I know many of you are using these techniques as well, they are contained in the water, blood, tissue, and hard parts. So there's a record within the middens that gives us some clues about the past. We can use some of these stable isotopes to look at diets, trophic levels, migration patterns. I've listed here 4 of the most common ones. And in this case, the one that we were looking at was nitrogen 15. And it's used a lot to understand a lot about diets and trophic levels. And there's this enrichment with trophic levels of 3.2 percentiles between trophic levels. And I'll show you why this matters in just a minute. In terms of trophic levels, the first is going to be up here near the top, underneath the killer whales, but we don't know to what extent they might be different between the prehistoric and the present ones. So here we've got a graph I've taken from a paper by Seth Newsom from Alaska, and they had, fortunate for us, looked at stable isotopes. And so from the modern Pribilof population, the Bering Sea, we're going to start here. So on the x-axis, I've got the ages in months. So the first 2 to 6 months, so newborn pups, they're still with mom largely nursing. And then mom leaves, the pups leave. They're then at sea for the first 2 years of life. And then they begin to come back to the islands as they mature and will begin to breed. And then, so what do they see? Well, here we see this drop here. So starting off here, they're nursing at the beginning. So you're seeing a milk signature. They've then transitioned into food in the Bering Sea, and then they're out in the North Pacific for the next couple of years until they start feeding like an adult, literally along the coast of North America. So what did the prehistoric look like? And this is what we got here. They're clearly different. And as I was looking at this, my first reaction is they did something wrong. This can't be. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit with anything else. But, I know this group, and there's no doubt that they did the analysis right. So then it's up to me and Francis to figure out, so what's different here? A couple of things to point out. First off is, so you see here for pups, for both the prehistoric and the current day, we have very similar signatures here between them, no significant difference. I'll also point out over here with the adults, the mums, that also there's no significant difference between them, although the red dots, the prehistoric is slightly higher. But the other thing is, as you look across, you can see that it is about 3.2 percentiles higher for the pups, which basically means that pups are eating their mums, is what it tells us. But they're eating, but the signal is most strongest associated with the Pribilof ones, not from the prehistoric ones. So there's something fine in this subtlety here, but there is consistency, but we still have to explain why there's such a strong difference between the stages once we've gone into that 6 months to 30-month period. So to understand that, we can go to satellite tracking data. In our case, we've done a lot of satellite tracking within the Bering Sea, looking at where they're feeding relative to where fishing has occurred. But I'm going to show you some data where it's been used to track them after weaning and with adults as well. You might wonder how easy it is to put on a tag on a fur seal, and I'll tell you, it's not that easy. And so in this case here, you can see we've got a bull watching over his harem of females. We're using this pole, but in order for us to get there that close, we have what I call our Trojan horse. And we go in this box. And it's like the Keystone Cop says we have to lift this up and move it slowly along. The bulls will slam into it. And then we'll pull a female up to the box. We'll pull her hinds in. And in this case, I was sitting on the catwalk because I took this picture. And the next thing I know is the guy pulling the tail end and pulled too hard, and the female was in the box with him. And everybody was like, they can't jump out of the box. But it was just like the worst moment ever. It's like your worst nightmare being caught in here. Anyway, they eventually got her out the hole. And we're very careful the next time they pulled a female in. So what do we learn from satellite tracking? And on this figure here, what you're going to see is we've got in blue, these are adult females that were tagged on St. Paul Island. And in green is Bogoslav, which is this volcanic island down by the Aleutian chain. And you can see then that we're picking up summer feeding trips in the beginning within the Bering Sea. And then we see this migration as they go across, heading essentially in a beeline for the coast of Washington, Oregon, and California, where they're going to feed, and then they'll go back up in the springtime back to breed again and give birth. But there's also two other colors you may have noticed here from San Miguel Island. And there you can see that those adult females, they're staying within the California current system. They're not going out. So in essence, the adult females are mixing at this point in time. What about the pups? Where do they go? And you can see that they don't go on this nice beeline the way that the females do. It's like this. It's like a massive spaghetti drawing. So let me decode the colors here with you. We've got St. George and St. Paul. Those are the two major Pribilof Islands in the Bering Sea in red and yellow. And then the dark or the greenish color is the Bogoslav animals. And so you can see then that they're like going, they don't really seem to have a plan. They don't really know where they're going, but they're feeding over a massive area of the North Pacific. And then we have over here, the San Miguel weaned pups. So they're about 6 months old. It's in the fall. And well, they come up into British Columbia, down into Mexico as well. But they're staying literally over the continental shelf and the shelf break and staying very close to land. So oceanographically, then, it seems that the fur seals that are born within the California current system largely stay within it for their entire lives, whereas those from the Pribilof Islands are coming down, and for adult females, they're coming down and they're feeding within the system as well. So let's have a quick look here at the stable isotopes and see how this makes sense. So for me, what we have here with the Pribilofs, the modern day, is they're coming out, feeding initially in the Bering Sea, then going down into the open North Pacific. And as they become mature adult females, they begin feeding within the California current system. And here, this signature is, oops, sorry. I think is a signature, which is a California current signature. And I say that in part because if you look at the females, we see this overlap where we know that both groups are spending a lot of time feeding. And so I think then it's telling me that prehistorically, that a lot of the animals that are in the middens were a combination of young animals that were born in California, although at this time there was no record of them having been there prehistorically. And the adult females were a mixture of both animals from the Pribilofs and from California. So that got us going through archival documents, including looking for newspapers from San Francisco and trying to read everything about skin. So we found one report that in around 1812, 150,000 skins were shipped out of San Francisco. And it turns out that there was a sealing station that the Russians had established on the Farallon Islands. And they were removing seals until they caused the extirpation or the extinction of fur seals in California. And of course, to the modern day biologist, we didn't really become aware of fur seals until the late 1800s. And that's when it came on our radar screen. So there's a whole piece of this history that was missing. And yet it fits with where these animals had to have been born. And the fact that we've seen them recolonize the areas more recently is also giving us a sense that these were traditional areas that were used by fur seals. So they were extirpated in 1841. So in terms of this mystery about the fur seals, I think we can say that this has been solved. The middens contain northern fur seal remains. There was never the remains of a Cape Flattery fur seal. It's not an extinct species. The adult females came from Alaska and California. The pups that they were finding in there, because this was very important, is like, how did the pups get there? Well, the pups were actually near-term fetuses. And there's lots of reports from sealing ships that when they had killed the females and were cleaning them, that they had pups on the decks of the ships. And also pups were taken back to the villages and kids would play with them as well. And so there's a lot of stories in there that we can make sense of how these pups end up being there, even though they weren't born in this area. And finally, the bulls, which would not have come from Alaska because they don't come that far south, they stay further north. They had to have been their remains from animals that were staying within the California current system that had been initially born in California. So this is always interesting. So why was it published if it's wrong? And of course, like Susan and us, they didn't put it out because it was wrong. They put everything together based on what they knew. But I think as scientists that were not archaeologists probably had a responsibility to respond to this sooner instead of putting it into court for a judge to pass judgment over whether or not the science was sound. So that still leaves this question of like, where do they come from? The first seals were not coming ashore. They had to have been coming from out here. So is there any record of people having gone out there in canoes to retrieve fur seals? So that got me digging into a lot of other things, including more pictures. And this is one of the pictures that really struck me. It's a canoe with a sail on it. And it was taken near La Push in 1893. And this part makes sense that if you could get offshore fast enough, I think paddling would just be not possible, but sailing is a whole other thing. You get offshore, and fur seals, they feed at night. And then in the daytime, they do this jug handle thing. They take their side flipper and their tails. It looks like you go and you could just pluck them up. And so we know that during the European sealing era, which most of that fleet was based in Victoria, they were going out, they're bringing First Nations from British Columbia out. They were former sealers themselves, and they were spearing animals here, and they would put canoes onto schooners to go out. So the animals are sleeping. I know I've encountered one, and you can hear it snoring even as it's sleeping out here, totally unaware of somebody approaching. So really out here, I call this our Serengeti, this whole continental margin. It's a very, very productive area, and fur seals are exploiting it. So there are a number of things that came up, everything from how far and how do you get back and winds and other things. But there were a number of stories. This was one that was recorded from Hal George, and he reported that seal hunters sometimes took off at 2 a.m. They wanted to go out to what was called Exposida, the blue water, the place where the ocean really gets deep. Another person, Beatrice Black, it was written down, she said, my brother used to go out as early as March, go out in the ocean, way out to get some seals. 2 or 3 months he'd go out. They risked their lives going way out 40 miles out in the ocean in an open canoe. 3 men in a canoe. Sometimes they'd be loaded with about 5, 6, or 10 seals. And there's a drawing here too to go with that. Chris Morganroch, I think he might have been an Indian agent at the time who was living with the Quileute. Anyway, he kept a diary, which I'm not sure his granddaughter or great-granddaughter ultimately published. And he's got a wonderful account explaining how he was woken up to go out on one of these trips, and there was a knock on his door at 2 or 3 in the morning, and describes the whole thing about how they went out. And so he reports here, seal hunting by coastal Indians takes place during these 2 months, April and May, in the 100-mile stretch of open sea between the mouth of the Trites and Cape Flattery. Here the seals approach nearest to land, their line of northerly migration being about 30 to 50 miles offshore. So all these accounts fit with what we know from modern day biology. The other thing is just appreciating the sailing abilities here with these canoes. So it says, when far out in ocean, unable to make shore, canoes were anchored thus. The sails were laid flat on the water, stones were tied to them at each end, and canoe made fast to the sails and stones by means of a rope. There's also sealing implements here, such as the spears, and even a picture taken here showing an animal sleeping and about to be speared. There he is sleeping right there. I should say she. And just remarkable the torque that's put onto that spear as it's being thrown. The other thing is that, again, having captured fur seals, knowing just like they've got razor sharp teeth, and they'll be brought in, and they've got a club here, which they would have used as the animals brought in close to the boat, because you're not going to bring it in just with a spear. You need to have it unconscious. So sealing implements as well. So in the end, it was just all the other information that connected the biology, the ecology, the archaeology, and the ethnography together. So at the end, then, the conclusions were that the Fairland and the Pribilof Islands were refugia for northern fur seals, where people had not previously lived. The islands produce this regular and dependable food and furs. It's one of the, well, we talked about how amazing the sea otter fur is. The second best would be the northern fur seals. It's very thick fur. The animals don't rely on their blubber to stay warm. They rely on the fur. And it came by literally like a herd of wildebeest every spring. Although I will say they do risk their lives in going out, but they knew what they were doing. The Cape Flattery fur seal, it never existed. It was only the northern fur seals, as well as the Guadalupe fur seals, that fed over this continental shelf area. But the northern fur seals were in the orders of millions. And the other thing is, as we think about the future, is the fact that as we see populations recover, in the United States, they have the Marine Mammal Protection Act, in Canada, we have the Fisheries Act. And we're in a period now where we're seeing the oceans being rewilded by marine mammals. And it's changing the balance. And I think it can also point us to rethink how California is looking as we see the recovery of many of the species that were hunted to near extinction. And the other point here is that the fact that the fur seals were in the middens, it shows without any sort of doubt that their fishing territory went out beyond the continental shelf break. So that was, the case was closed. And then we waited for months and months and months, and there wasn't a jury, just the judge. And it came back, and they couldn't believe it. They won their case. And it came down to northern fur seals, of all things. Not what anybody thought in the beginning. All of us were thinking about whales when this started. It did go to appeal, and the Macaw appealed it, as did the US government, and they lost on appeal. So the government and the Macaw lost, and so their fishing rights have been established, something they've been fighting for over 150 years. And I think one of the other things in here is that after the court case was concluded, we were invited down, all the experts invited to come to a celebration. There were two, one that the Quillot hosted, one that the Quinault hosted. And then afterwards, when they won, there was a third one where we all came together. And we were, initially we're just thanked because for everything from helping them know more about their history, but also just being there for them was important. And they expected to lose. But anyway, they were still going forward with it. But then when they won, it was another thing. But I just want to share something because, you know, we talk about these sorts of things without really sort of experiencing perhaps the other side of it. And so I took some video here as one of the celebrations here. And so just to show the people's lives who were affected by, in this case, bringing science to the table. So that I want to thank you and be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. We have time for questions, both in the room and online. Online, you can type your questions into the chat if you have any. And Andrew, I'll ask you to, either Natasha will read out the online or you take the ones from the audience, and I'll ask you to summarize the question so everyone can hear it.
There's a question online from Nicholas. He's asking, do we know if fur seals remained only in refugia before or after European arrival and exploitation?
So the question is, do we know whether or not they were in refugia before Europeans' arrival?
Or after?
I guess I don't quite know how to answer that one, other than we do know that the sites where they were being hunted, that no people had ever gone to. So there's no records of people having been to any of these other islands. It isn't to say that someone hadn't discovered it, but nobody was living there and it wasn't a regular source. So they were likely at other spots too. There's no doubt that, I know there's one site in Southeast Alaska where I've seen furs starting to breed there. That's probably a new site, because anywhere that people could get access to this species, they would have been very easy to hunt, and compared to a Steller sea lion or a California sea lion, for example. Mm-hmm.
Were those raw values just compared to each other, or was there a baseline?
So that was not my research. In this case here, we're pulling research that, oh, the question was whether or not the stable isotope values were raw values or process values. I'm not sure what the.
So often the baseline to compare with each other.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult to get or to start. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, so she's asking an excellent question, which I can't answer because it's not my field whatsoever. I do know that the team that was on the paper, they work a lot with stable isotopes, so I'd like to think that they took into account how to correct for those possible errors and differences. But I would love for you to read the paper and you can tell me, because one thing is we haven't written this up yet, and we still want to, and it's a question of going back and picking up on just those sorts of things. So I would love to talk to you more and get your opinion on it. Thanks.
Andrew?
I have a comment and then a question. And it just like makes apparent how problematic things like that housing decision, which imposes a 9-mile limit on the nation as like the traditional fishing waters, such a constraint when these are historic sea voyaging people with, you know, trans-Pacific travel. I'm curious, my question is you presented a list of, you know, evidence that can factor into this investigation, and I wondered if you'd consider adding Indigenous people, Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge to that list, right? And that absolutely, this is the tribe asking you for this, and that's awesome. But just thinking in other contexts, this isn't so long ago, and this isn't the like the known histories of people.
Yeah.
And was that something that came up?
Yeah. Along there to summarize. I think what Andrew's then asking is, you know, what sort of traditional knowledge was brought in from the Quill and Quinault? What did they bring to the table? Were they consulted perhaps to include their knowledge? So, you know, what I don't know for sure on that is that, you know, I know the lawyer, she was Navajo. I know that they had community members that were part of the legal team advising. I know they were uncovering documents, everything we could find. So we certainly try to include everything that was available. In the case of these two tribes, there was a lot of conflict with European settlers, and a lot of their heritage was destroyed. Their villages were burnt down. A lot of atrocious things happened to them, and a lot of their knowledge was lost. So, you know, so all I can say is that I know for the community side, they were very much part of the process. And we were given, every time I would ask for information, we could get everything we could, but I didn't go in to interview people or other things. There were others part of this team because they had language specialists, they had archaeologists, they had so many people with different areas of expertise, including community members. And so, but it is interesting to know whether or not there'd be something additional to add into this, and I don't know.
Yeah, it's clear that lead and all of that. It's more about making the broader case when you go to write that,
Mhm.
that can fit into the puzzle of the evidence.
Yeah, no, and I'd like to talk to you more about that as well, of things that maybe this triggered with you as you're hearing it, and aspects we should know about it as well. Okay, thanks, Andrew. Josh?
Question about the conflict between both First Nations.
Mm-hmm.
What was that about?
So the conflict. Oh, sorry, he's asking, sorry for everybody's online. I think what you're really asking is like, so why were the Makah siding with the US government? I mean, haven't all the indigenous people suffered from the US government treatment? And that's true. But you have to understand too, that there's a lot of unwritten history, such as the fact that the Quileute used to be their territory. Cape Flattery was theirs. And the people that came down from Vancouver Island massacred them. They took prisoners, slaves. There's a lot of bad blood there. And so they've never really healed it. And so in this case, though, it came down to money. And so the Makah have been fishing for hake. They have a portion of the hake. So they're getting a lot of money from this. In contrast, the Quileute and Quinault are very poor, and they don't have the same access to resources. What they wanted was not the right to go and kill seals. That's not what they're after. They're not after whaling. What they would like is to have a share of commercial fishing, the right to have a proportion of it. So really the fight was over, the Makah have to give up part of what they're getting. And so, things that came in court was, things like saying like, well, from the Makah, like, you guys, you were afraid of the ocean. Anything you did it, there's what you learned from us. And so there's just a lot of bad blood on here, but it goes back centuries and centuries and centuries, the stories of things that happened. So in this case here, this court decision is going to change their lives, particularly, for children, their education, the ability to have a better standard of living, because they will have access to a portion of the fishing rights. But they had to prove that they were using these waters offshore.
I was curious if you had a chance in the process to discuss this work with the authors of the original Cape Flattery.
Yes, so the question is if I had a chance to interact with the authors of the Cape Flattery paper. And the answer is yes. And how can I say on this? They still cling to it. And one of those things, it was just a hypothesis, and that's fine, a hypothesis, an idea, but sometimes these things take on a life bigger. And so at the end of the day, yeah, not happy by comments that were made. But the reality is, as a biologist, it just doesn't fit with anything. It's literally, for me, it's like a fairy tale. I didn't say it in those terms, but it is. And so, yes, you put your best foot forward, but even in the research that we do, we put our best foot forward. We make a conclusion, but I think the downfall in science is if we're going to stand by that, we're going to fall on our swords, we're going to defend it forever. I think it's important to recognize when knowledge has moved on, and we acknowledge that at that time it was the best that we knew, but now we've got more information and we've learned from it. But sometimes in some fields, some people really want to cling to it as though, but it's not a sign of, I mean, in the end, they brought interesting information together, in fact, information that we learned about from what they cited. So I think they made a valuable contribution, but I think it's also important to recognize that it was just one step in the process of knowledge as we try to test ideas and get to the truth.